That sunny afternoon. As I opened the door, I could never have imagined that a simple conversation with my kind-hearted neighbor, still grieving the loss of his wife, would lead to a revelation that left me stunned. What started as a casual visit soon turned into an emotional confession that altered the course of our relationship forever. Join me as we dive into this unexpected and deeply moving story. Thank you for listening to the story. It was a warm, tranquil afternoon when I heard a soft knock at my door. The sound was gentle yet deliberate, carrying a certain weight that caught my attention. When I opened it, there stood Ryan, my neighbor from across the street. He had always been a kind man, his presence marked by a warm smile that could ease even the tensest moments. There was a quiet dignity about him, a resilience that had earned the admiration of everyone on our street. But today, something about him felt different. Like a piece of that resilience had cracked just enough to reveal a glimpse of the man beneath. Ryan had been through a great deal in the past year. Everyone in our close-knit neighborhood knew his story. Around 9 months ago, his wife passed away. It was a profound loss. Not just for him but for all of us who had come to love and respect her. She was his sun, his compass. And when she was gone, it was as if his world dimmed, the colors fading to muted shades of gray. Since then, Ryan had lived alone in the big house that once overflowed with laughter and life. His children, grown and ambitious, were pursuing their dreams far away in other countries. Though he spoke of them with pride, it was clear their absence left a void. At 60 years old, Ryan was still physically strong, his broad shoulders unbowed by time. But his spirit seemed weathered, worn thin by months of solitude. Many of us on the street had tried, in our own ways, to lift his spirits. Some suggested he might consider remarrying, perhaps finding someone new to share his life with. But each time, Ryan would shake his head with a quiet firmness. "I'm too old for that," he would say, his voice tinged with finality. "My heart belongs to my wife. No one could ever replace her." Though his words were resolute, I often wondered if they reflected the whole truth. Deep down, did he miss companionship? Was there a part of him that longed for the comfort of a partner's presence but couldn't bring himself to admit it? Maybe the idea of moving on felt like a betrayal of the love he still held for his late wife. Or maybe he feared the judgment of others, or even his own heart. As I looked at him now, standing at my door with a quiet vulnerability in his eyes, I couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. There was a subtle change in his demeanor, a longing that hadn't been there before, or at least one he had managed to hide. When I invited him in, he stepped inside hesitantly, as though crossing a threshold not just into my home but into a conversation he wasn't sure he was ready to have. "How are you doing, Ryan?" I asked, hoping to ease his discomfort with a warm smile. He returned the smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm okay," he said softly, his voice lacking its usual steadiness. "And you? How's everything going?" We exchanged pleasantries for a moment, but I could sense the effort behind his words. He seemed more subdued than usual, his shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. When I asked about his children, his gaze fell to the floor, and his voice grew even quieter. "They're doing well," he said, his tone tinged with melancholy. "Busy with their studies and their own lives. They don't call as often as they used to." The sadness in his words was unmistakable, and it mirrored the loneliness etched into his features. For a moment, silence hung between us, heavy but not uncomfortable. It felt like he was gathering the courage to say something he'd been holding back for a long time. Finally, he broke the silence. His voice barely above a whisper. "I'm lonely," he admitted. His vulnerability startling in its honesty. "I don't know what to do with all this time by myself. I just needed to come by and see you." His words struck a chord deep within me. Ryan, who had always been a pillar of strength and wisdom, now seemed so human, so raw. The loneliness he carried was palpable. And for the first time, I saw him not just as my kind neighbor but as a man longing for connection, for solace. "I'm glad you came," I said gently, hoping my words could provide even a small measure of comfort. "You're always welcome here." He gave a faint nod. But there was still something unspoken lingering in the air. His eyes, though kind, seemed restless, darting around as if searching for the right words. When he finally met my gaze, there was an intensity one hadn't seen before. "Do you ever think we could be more than just friends?" he asked, his voice both tentative and earnest. The question hung in the air, startling in its simplicity yet profound in its implications. For a moment, I was at a loss for words. Ryan had always been a respected elder, someone I admired but had never thought of in a romantic light. Yet, in that moment, his vulnerability, his humanity, made me see him in a new way. He wasn't just my neighbor anymore. He was a man who, despite his grief and loneliness, was reaching out, daring to hope for something more. His question caught me off guard, stopping me mid-thought as if the air around us had shifted. I wasn't expecting him to say that. For a moment, I simply stared at him, unsure how to respond. He wasn't just talking about friendship anymore. His voice carried something deeper, a quiet intensity that was impossible to ignore. He met my gaze, his expression serious but tinged with vulnerability. "Since my wife passed away," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "you're the only woman I've felt close to. I find you attractive." The words hung in the air, their weight settling between us like an unspoken truth finally laid bare. I could see the raw emotion in his eyes. It must have taken a tremendous amount of courage for him to say those words. Ryan had always been the kind of man who carried his burdens quietly, not wanting to trouble anyone else with his pain. And yet, here he was, sharing something so deeply personal, so intimately tied to his heart. I stood there, feeling the gravity of the moment pressing down on me. He wasn't just my neighbor anymore. He wasn't even just the man who had endured unimaginable loss. In that moment, he was someone seeking connection. Someone who had spent months locked in the silence of his own thoughts, longing for a sense of closeness that had eluded him. I didn't know you felt that way," I finally managed, my voice barely audible. He offered me a small, sad smile. "I didn't expect to feel this way either," he admitted. "But over time, I realized how much you mean to me. You've been so kind. Always checking in. Always making sure I'm okay. It made me see you differently." There was a warmth in his words that I couldn't ignore. But they also left me conflicted. He was much older than me, more than twice my age, and until now, I had never thought of him in any light other than that of a kind, neighborly figure. And yet, as I stood there listening to him, I couldn't deny the sincerity in his voice, the genuine affection behind his words. He paused, as though gathering the courage to continue. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, he said. His tone soft. Almost apologetic. I needed to tell you how I feel. You're young. Beautiful. And full of life. And I know I might not be what you're looking for. But I wanted you to know what's in my heart. The hope in his eyes was almost heartbreaking, mingled with an unmistakable fear of rejection. For a moment, I found myself torn. I cared about him. Deeply even. But I wasn't sure if I could see him the way he saw me. There was a line between us that I hadn't considered crossing. And now it loomed before me, blurred and uncertain. We sat down. And our conversation shifted to lighter topics. As if we both needed a reprieve from the heaviness of what had just been said. He shared stories about his younger days. Tales of his children. And memories of his late wife that painted her as a woman full of grace and warmth. I found myself laughing at some of his anecdotes. The sound feeling foreign after the weight of his confession. But then, as the hours passed and the conversation grew deeper, the air between us changed again. He looked at me. His expression serious yet gentle. You know, he began softly. You're not just beautiful, you're intelligent. Compassionate. And strong. I've noticed that about you for a long time. His words made me feel flustered. Caught off guard by his sudden earnestness. Thank you. I replied. Unsure of what else to say. He leaned forward slightly. His gaze steady. I may be older. But that just means I've lived long enough to understand what matters in life. I could share that with you, guide you in ways you might not have considered. The shift in his tone was subtle. But unmistakable. I felt my breath hitch as he added. Why don't you come sit with me? We could talk more, maybe explore something new together. His words carried a sincerity that made it clear he wasn't playing games. But they also carried an undercurrent of something more intimate. Something that left me momentarily stunned. I didn't know how to respond. My mind raced. Caught between the familiarity of the man I had always known and the unfamiliarity of what he was now asking of me. I don't know. I finally said. My voice faltering. This is all so unexpected. I understand, he said quickly. Leaning back slightly as if to give me space. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. I felt so alone. And when I'm with you, it feels different. It feels good. His vulnerability was palpable. And it made my chest ache. I thought about the months I had seen him retreat into himself. The countless nights he must have spent sitting in the silence of his empty house. I thought about the kindness he had shown me over the years. The way he had always been there when I needed help or advice. But this was something entirely different. I care about you. I said softly. Choosing my words carefully. But I'm not sure I can give you what you're looking for. His expression shifted. A mix of acceptance and sadness flickering across his face. I understand, he said. His voice quiet. I needed to tell you how I felt. You deserve to know. In that moment, I realized the depth of his loneliness. The courage it had taken for him to open up. And though I wasn't sure where this left us, I knew one thing for certain: Ryan wasn't just my neighbor anymore. He was someone I cared for deeply. Someone I couldn't bear to see hurting. As I nodded, agreeing to his unexpected proposition, Ryan's eyes lit up with a mix of relief and nervous excitement. Are you sure? He asked. His voice low and tentative. As though he needed reassurance that my response wasn't born out of obligation or pity. Yes. I said softly, my heart racing as the weight of the moment pressed down on me. Deep inside, I felt a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. I wasn't entirely sure what had drawn me to say yes. Perhaps it was the way he looked at me, with a reverence and vulnerability that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't before. Or maybe it was the pull of the unknown, the allure of stepping into uncharted territory. He reached out and gently took my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "I'll take care of you," he said, his voice steady yet tinged with emotion. "We don't have to rush." There was something soothing in his words, a promise of patience and care that put me at ease. If only a little. The tension between us grew, unspoken yet palpable, as though the room itself held its breath, waiting for what might come next. I let the moment carry me, unsure of where it would lead but unable to turn away. There was a strange comfort in the way he looked at me, a mix of longing and tenderness that spoke to the loneliness we both felt. As he moved closer, his eyes searched mine for permission, for understanding. Then, slowly and deliberately, he leaned in, his lips brushing softly against mine in a kiss that was steady and sure. His touch carried the weight of years of love, loss, and experience. It wasn't hurried or demanding. Instead, it was careful and measured, as though he wanted to savor every second, to ensure that I felt safe and valued. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let myself sink into the moment, letting go of the hesitations that had been swirling in my mind. When he pulled back slightly, his eyes met mine, searching for any sign of discomfort. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, filled with genuine concern. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. His gentleness was disarming, and in that moment, I felt a strange sense of trust one hadn't expected. He smiled softly, then reached for my hand again, guiding me toward the bed with a patience that was almost reverent. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if to show me that there was no rush, no pressure, just the two of us, figuring out this unfamiliar connection together. As we sat on the edge of the bed, I could feel the weight of the moment settling over us. The vulnerability between us was tangible, and yet, it didn't feel overwhelming. Instead, it felt like an unspoken understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of the emptiness we both carried and the tentative hope that this moment might ease it, if only for a while. "I want this to be good for you," he said softly, his voice steady yet tender. "Tell me if you feel uncomfortable, and we'll stop. I mean that." I nodded again, appreciating his words more than I could say. His reassurance helped calm the nervousness fluttering in my chest, though it didn't entirely dispel it. As he leaned in again, his lips found mine, this time with a bit more confidence, a bit more depth. His hands rested lightly on my shoulders, their warmth seeping through the fabric of my shirt. As we lay down, his touch was careful, unhurried, and filled with a kind of quiet devotion I hadn't expected. I could tell this wasn't just about physical closeness for him. It was about connection, about reaching out after months, maybe years, of feeling untethered. The tenderness in his movements spoke volumes, a silent expression of gratitude and longing that went beyond words. When he began to undress, there was a moment of hesitation, as though he was unsure how I would react. I watched as he unbuttoned his shirt, revealing a body that bore the marks of time, lines and creases that told a story of a life lived fully. Yet, beneath it all, There was a strength that surprised me. A vitality that seemed to defy his years. I found myself captivated. Not just by his physical form but by the way he carried himself. There was a quiet confidence in his movements. A grace that spoke of experience and self-assurance. He wasn't trying to impress me, he was simply being himself. And that authenticity was both disarming and endearing. As he stood before me, I felt a rush of emotions, curiosity, nervousness, and a surprising sense of admiration. This was a side of him I had never seen. And it made my heart race in ways I hadn't expected. "I know this is new for you," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "It's new for me too. In a way. But I promise to be patient. To take this one step at a time." His words carried a sincerity that eased some of my lingering doubts. I nodded, feeling the nervousness in my chest give way to a tentative sense of trust. Whatever this was, whatever it might become, I knew it wasn't something either of us had entered into lightly. As we continued, the moments that followed were filled with a mix of emotions, nervous laughter, quiet vulnerability, and an undeniable sense of connection. It wasn't perfect. And it wasn't without its moments of awkwardness. But it was real. And in the end, that was what mattered most. For both of us, this was about more than filling the emptiness. It was about finding a sense of closeness, of belonging, in a world that often felt too big and too lonely. And in that moment, as we lay side by side, I couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, we had found exactly what we needed. There was something profoundly intimate in the way he looked at me. A gaze that seemed to hold more than mere attraction. It was as though he was silently inviting me into a world he had kept locked away for far too long. His eyes weren't just looking, they were searching, asking me to see him fully. In that fleeting moment, I became acutely aware of the connection sparking between us. As he stepped closer, the space between us dissolved, and his lips met mine in a kiss that was both gentle and deliberate. That first kiss wasn't just an act. A wave of warmth surged through me, wrapping itself around my senses and making my heart race with a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. Then, as his hands moved with a careful purpose, undressing me piece by piece, I felt a complex blend of emotions, vulnerability mingling with excitement, uncertainty intertwining with exhilaration. Every inch of fabric that fell away was like shedding layers of hesitation, leaving me bare in more ways than one. When the last barrier was removed, and our bodies pressed together, it was as if the air around us vibrated with an unspoken energy. The electricity between us was palpable, crackling like a summer storm about to break, filling the room with a tension that was both thrilling and consuming. His enjoyment was evident in every glance, every lingering touch. But it wasn't just about him. I found myself surrendering to the moment, giving into a freedom I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. It wasn't simply about physical connection, it was a liberation of spirit. A rediscovery of something raw and unfiltered within me. He moved with a confidence born of experience, his hands exploring my skin with an almost reverent precision. Every touch seemed intentional, as if he was mapping the terrain of my body, learning the places where desire simmered just beneath the surface. His fingers brushed against my most sensitive spots with a skillful awareness, drawing out responses I didn't know I was capable of. Each caress was a question, and every shiver that followed was my answer. The air was thick with the scent of intimacy, the quiet hum of our breaths merging into a symphony of unspoken emotions. I couldn't help but marvel at the way he navigated this uncharted territory between us. guiding me with a balance of strength and tenderness that left me utterly captivated. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't holding back. I was present, alive, and unashamedly vulnerable in the arms of someone who seemed to understand the gravity of that trust. What unfolded wasn't just a moment, it was a journey, a rediscovery of emotions I had tucked away, of sensations I had almost forgotten. With every glance, every touch, every shared breath, we built something that felt sacred, even if fleeting. And as I gazed into his eyes, sparkling with a joy that mirrored my own, I realized that this wasn't just about the connection of our bodies. It was about the meeting of two souls, each finding a kind of solace and exhilaration in the other. I was surprised by his restraint. It wasn't something I had encountered before. Not in this way. Most boys, driven by impulse, seldom paused to think about the consequences. They acted on instinct, unburdened by foresight. But he was different. He had a quiet kind of self-control, an awareness that was both refreshing and admirable. He moved with purpose, ensuring nothing would happen that might lead to a child, an outcome neither of us was ready for. That thoughtfulness set him apart, and I found myself respecting him even more. The warmth of his touch lingered on my skin, strange yet thrilling, like an echo of the closeness we had just shared. It was as though every nerve in my body had come alive, leaving me hyper-aware of each sensation. My cheeks flushed, and I felt the heat rising, an involuntary reaction that made me smile to myself. How could something so simple, so human, feel so intense? Yet it did. And I found myself reveling in the beauty of that moment. We exchanged a secret smile, one that carried the weight of shared understanding. In that instant, I realized this wasn't just an experience to be tucked away and forgotten, it was something that had drawn us closer, deepening a connection I hadn't even known we were building. When it was over, a wave of warmth washed over me, filling me with a quiet contentment. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper. A lightness that settled in my chest, lifting a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. His expression mirrored mine. A soft, almost boyish smile playing on his lips as he looked at me. It wasn't just satisfaction I saw in his eyes, it was gratitude. A kind of joy that spoke volumes. We lay there together, wrapped in the glow of what we had just shared, enveloped by a silence that felt more comforting than any words could. The room was warm and still, the only sounds the gentle rhythm of our breathing, which seemed to fall into sync as if our bodies were attuned to each other. I turned to him, searching his face, and saw a reflection of my own thoughts in his eyes, a contentment that went beyond the physical. This wasn't just an encounter, it was a moment of vulnerability, of trust. We had opened ourselves to each other, shedding the layers of pretense and fear that so often keep people apart. In that quiet space, I felt something close to joy, a sense of peace in knowing we had found something rare and meaningful. Even if only for a short while. Time seemed to stand still as we lay there, his arm resting lightly around me, his presence anchoring me in the moment. Eventually, he leaned back against the pillows, his eyes growing heavy with sleep. I watched him, noting how his features softened, the usual tension in his expression melting away. There was something profoundly peaceful about seeing him like this, as if the burdens he carried had been lifted, if only temporarily. His breathing slowed, steady and even, and I felt a pang of tenderness, knowing how much he had needed this moment of reprieve. When he stirred again, his eyes met mine, and a grateful smile spread across his face. "Thank you for that moment," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. There was something about the way he spoke, the quiet sincerity in his tone, that made my heart swell. It wasn't just about the physical connection, it was about the solace we had given each other, the unspoken understanding that had passed between us. For him, this had been more than an escape, it had been a sanctuary. A space where he could let go of the weight he carried. And for me, it had been a reminder of the beauty in connection, the power of being seen and understood. In that moment, I realized that we had both filled a void in each other's lives, if only for an instant. As he drifted back to sleep, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected turn our relationship had taken. This wasn't just a fleeting encounter, it was something that had changed us both in subtle but profound ways. We had shared an intimacy that went beyond the physical, bridging the gap between loneliness and companionship, creating a bond that felt unbreakable, even in its fragility. When he woke again, his eyes were softer, his expression lighter than I had ever seen. "I never expected to feel this way again," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently as a smile tugged at my lips. "Neither did I," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. We talked for hours, sharing pieces of ourselves that had remained hidden for too long. Dreams, fears, hopes, we laid them bare, as if rediscovering not just each other but also ourselves in the process. As the sun began to set, its golden light spilling across the room, I felt a quiet certainty that this was more than just a moment. It was a beginning. Even as we prepared to part ways, there was no sadness. Instead, there was gratitude for the connection we had found, for the healing we had begun together. Life is unpredictable, often cruel, but sometimes it offers moments of unexpected beauty. This was one of those moments, a memory I knew I would carry with me, its warmth a beacon in the uncertain days ahead. With a promise to meet again, I stepped away, my heart lighter than it had been in years. Whatever the future held, I knew we had given each other something priceless: hope, comfort, and the courage to move forward, no longer alone. In that moment, I realized that the most unexpected events can teach us the most valuable lessons. The relationship between my neighbor and me had gone beyond the boundaries of age or societal norms. It was a connection between two souls trying to fill the emptiness in their lives. What will our decisions today lead to in the future? Only time will tell. But I believe that the courage to face our true emotions is always worth it. If I could offer you one piece of advice, it would be this: never close your heart to new experiences, as you never know what opportunities might be waiting. However, tread carefully and stay true to your values and emotions, for only you can define the meaning of your own life. Thank you for staying with me through this emotional story. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button to keep up with more surprising and meaningful content in the videos to come.